Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to tonight's Hammer Forum on the impeachment trials with Jessica Levinson and Michael Genovese, and our moderator tonight, Shaniqua McClendon. Before we get started, I want to remind you to please silence your cell phones and note that taking photos and video is not permitted in the theater, but we are recording this and we'll put it up on our website. So if you want to share it with anybody after tonight, you can do that from our website. I also want to quickly mention some other upcoming Hammer programs you might be interested in. Tomorrow night is our next Constitution Happy Hour, which is super fun. It's kind of like a book club with a bar, but the book is the United States Constitution. And we all read sections of the Constitution together, and they're led by constitutional scholars who will examine specific points in the Constitution. So we've done emoluments clause, we've done impeachment. Tomorrow night's topic is there a constitutional right to vote? Sounds obvious, right? It's not obvious. We'll read all the passages of the Constitution that address voting rights, and then we'll address where the gaping holes are. Everybody who comes gets a free copy of the Constitution, plus some really fun quizzes, like could you pass the U.S. citizenship quiz? I know I can't, I failed. But anyway, it's a fun event. It's from 6 to 8, and I am not being deported because I'm Caucasian of European descent, and so we just get a free pass, which is a real problem. And I have not been incarcerated yet. Anyway, the next Hammer Forum is on February 13th, where we'll discuss the politics and law behind campaign spending and advertising, and whether this spending distorts our elections, as well as how social media changes elections, and what we'll be voting on in March. We also have a Barry Jenkins film retrospective, a talk with Jane Fonda about climate change activism, and a number of programs around human rights issues in Central America. And we're a polling place for the March 3rd election, and we're also throwing a Super Tuesday viewing party for people to gather and watch the election results together. So we have a lot going on, and you are all welcome. We'd love to have you back at our free public programs. So on to tonight's program. The Hammer Forum is a monthly series of public discussions about current social and political issues, and it's made possible with support from the Rosenblum family. Tonight's forum is intended to be an impeachment recap, bringing everyone up to speed. We actually thought it would be wrapped up by now when we planned this last October, but we're still in the middle of the impeachment trial, so please don't expect any resolutions tonight. Hopefully, I don't know if you're all suffering from impeachment fatigue. I am. I've been listening maniacally, and that's why we have coffee and cookies to keep you engaged in this important democratic process. So now I'd like to briefly introduce our guest speakers. Jessica Levinson is a professor of law at Loyola Law School, where she's also the founding director of the Loyola Law Public Service Institute, which trains the next generation of leaders in government service. Levinson studies the law of the political process, including election law and governance issues. Her work focuses on ethics, political corruption, voting rights, campaign finance, ballot initiatives, redistricting, term limits, and state budgets. Until last year, she served as the president of the LA Ethics Commission. Previously, she served as director of political reform at the Center for Governmental Studies, a nonprofit research organization that looks at ethics and campaign financing. She has a weekly legal segment on KCRW's Press Play and frequently contributes op-ed pieces to NBC.com. In addition, she regularly appears on MSNBC, CNN, I think she was on CNN tonight, CBS, NBC, and Fox News, and is a go-to source for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Associated Press, the LA Times, and Politico, and many other media outlets. Michael Genovese is a professor of political science at Loyola Law School, where he holds the Loyola Chair of Leadership Studies. He's also the director of the Institute for Leadership Studies and president of the Global Policy Institute at Loyola Marymount University. He's written 50 books, including How Trump Governs, an Assessment and a Prognosis, The Trumping of American Politics, The Paradoxes of the American Presidency, The Power of the American Presidency, 1789 to 2000, The Encyclopedia of the American Presidency, and Memo to a New President, The Art and Science of Presidential Leadership. So I guess he kind of has something to say about what's going on right now. Professor Genovese has been the Washington Center's scholar in residence at 3 Democratic national political campaigns and at the 2008 presidential inauguration, and he served as scholar in residence at the 2012 Republican National Convention. During the presidency of George H.W. Bush, he served as consultant on crisis management at the Department of Defense and the Pentagon. Our moderator tonight is Shaniqua McClendon. McClendon is the political director for Crooked Media, home to the popular podcast Pod Save America. At Crooked Media, she led the creation of their midterm voter engagement program, Vote Save America. She's a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, where she earned her master's in public policy. During her studies, she also worked at Facebook on their politics and government outreach team. Prior to graduate school, she served in various capacities on Capitol Hill, starting off as an intern in the Obama administration, and then she was a staff assistant for Senator Kay Hagan, and went on to serve as legislative director for Congresswoman Alma S. Adams. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jessica Levinson, Michael Genovese, and Shaniqua McClendon.
Good evening, everyone. How are y'all? That is great. I don't know how many of you were at our the last time the 3 of us were together in October, but a lot has happened since then. When I was getting my notes together for this, I realized that we had not even had any public hearings the last time the 3 of us were together. So yeah, a lot has happened since then. So we'll dive into it and just try to understand what's going on. But I thought a good place to start. So something is in my eye here. October 22nd was when we had the first impeachment discussion, and that was the day that Bill Taylor testified behind closed doors with the House committees that had jurisdiction over impeachment, and that was also the day that his testimony was leaked, and it was pretty explosive, and he pretty much said that Donald Trump was tying Ukraine's aid money to an investigation into the Bidens. And then soon after, we got into the public hearing portion of the impeachment process. So that is where I would like to kind of kick off. If both of you could just kind of walk us through what has happened since the last time we were all together.
What has happened? We know the end of the movie. It's like going into a room and someone says, "Oh, I read that book, it's so good," and the butler did it. We know how this ends. So why would we do this if we know the end of the story? We do this because for 200 years the United States has been trying to push back the jungle. Alexander Hamilton, who's been quoted a lot in these hearings, said in Federalist Number 1, he wondered if we had the capacity to build a government based on reason and choice rather than force and accident. Because history told us that force and accident dominated. But the framers wanted to push back the jungle, limit government, limit the ability of a government to impose its will against the wishes of the people. And so we cleared the brush and tried to establish a system of government that held back the grosser manifestations of irrationality. We call it liberal democracy. It's the rule of law, checks and balances. It's all those things that we pledge allegiance to. That's under threat today, and that's why we're here today, and that's why we have impeachment today, because the forces of illiberal democracy are on the rise throughout the world. You see it in the form of elected leaders who don't have checks and balances, but are elected to overcome those things in government that impede the will of those elected folks. We see it in Turkey, we see it in Poland, we see it in Hungary, we see it in Russia. Maybe we're seeing it in the United States. And so this whole impeachment thing is about pushing back that jungle. And will the rule of law be maintained, or will the jungle come over again and cover us? Hamilton was very pessimistic. He felt he could not answer the question in the affirmative. Can we base our government on reason and choice, or are we stuck with force? And to me, that's what this is all about. It's about standing up for liberal democracy, for the rule of law. That is not to say that you should think that Donald Trump is guilty or should be convicted, and that's your opinion, and there are reasonable people can disagree on that. But to me, we're here because we have to fight to push the jungle back, and the jungle is always encroaching. And so that's what I think we've seen in the last couple of weeks, last couple of months since we were here together. We've seen efforts to try to keep the jungle at bay, and it's a constant battle.
Thank you. So kind of thinking back to where we were 4 months ago, I guess, 3 or 4 months ago, we saw a lot of people who work for Donald Trump at the State Department, people who were ambassadors because they gave him a lot of money, come in and testify. And we learned a lot during those public hearings. I know that impeachment, Jessica, is not, it's not a court case. There is a trial going on right now, but it's not a typical court case any of us would witness. But as we were seeing those witnesses come in and testify, how does their testimony impact what's going on in the legal sense? And how can, as lawmakers are doing their constitutional duties, take the testimony that came in and make their decisions?
Yes, great question. So let me say, I'm really excited to be back. When I was looking over our notes, it was the three of us last time, I thought, God, that's been a really long 6 months. And then I realized, good Lord, it's been 2.5 because it's felt like such a stressful time. I also want to thank basically all of our family friends for coming in this section over here. But it's not a guaranteed cheering squad, I've learned over many years. So that wasn't a punchline. So you asked me kind of what is the effect of the testimony? And in the lead up to the question, what you said is, I know this isn't a normal trial, or I know that this isn't a legal proceeding. And I would say this is the thing that I end up saying the most. And we've been interviewed about this a lot, which is we are not in a courtroom. So the rules of evidence do not apply. Yes, there is a judge there, but this is nothing like a typical courtroom. This is political theater, emphasis on the theater. And so and how do I know that for sure? Because I really believe one side has the facts, one side has the law, and that side's gonna lose. And that typically does not happen in a court of law. That can happen in a political theater. And so what was the impact of the testimony? This is one of the things that we actually talked about, which is we'll actually looking at people and hearing them say, for instance, Ambassador Yovanovitch say, I was really scared. I don't know why I was forced to leave my position. I just wanted to be a public servant. My reputation has been smeared. Whether or not something in our representatives would shift and they would say, I don't care if I have an R next to my name, or I don't care if I have a D next to my name, but there's something going on here that is problematic to our framework and our structure and the fabric of our country. And that absolutely did not happen. And so what I saw is witness after witness come in and tell very consistent stories. And what I saw is time and time again, the most important thing to come out of this process is, can you count how many Democrats are in the room? Can you count how many Republicans are in the room?
And you mentioned everyone's testimony and consistent stories. There was one story, Ambassador Sandlin, his testimony behind closed doors. I think he was first, so he didn't get to hear what everyone else was talking about. But after he was able to find out what other people said in their testimony, when he had his public testimony, he seemed to remember a lot more things, or didn't want to commit to some of the stuff he had said before. But again, this is not a real trial. So why did he change his story if seemingly there wouldn't be any legal repercussions for that?
Well, they're still under oath.
Okay.
So it's like this quasi-legal proceeding in the sense that, you're in the Senate chambers instead of in a courtroom, or you're before the House instead of in a courtroom. But it doesn't really matter where you are if you're under oath. I mean, if we decide to put someone, to put me under oath right now, I mean, look, as it turns out, it's not like class. I'm actually being truthful with you, as opposed to my students where I try and lie occasionally to keep them on their toes. But there are still repercussions to lying under oath. And I think that he had a sense that the full story might come out. And so it was better off to correct the record than to face a perjury charge. You might have a different view than I do.
Yeah. And kind of I hate to consider the politics of this because it's supposed to be, people we elected upholding their duty. But as we listen to those public hearings, do you think there was an impact on public perception and how people were viewing Trump in all of this, and if they actually thought now, maybe he did do something wrong that is worth being impeached for?
Well, I think the impact has been that views have hardened, they haven't changed. And that's a function of the hyper-partisan world that we're in today. I was talking about this in class the other day, that 40 years ago, it was not uncommon for us to be ticket splitters. You vote for a president of one party, a senator from another. Today, there's virtually no ticket splitting going on. 40 years ago, you had liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, or 50 years ago. Today, you have none of that. The parties are sorted out ideologically. And with gerrymandering, the safe districts, they go further and further to the two extremes. And so I think what's happened is rather than the testimony changing views, it's hardened views. That people go in with a tribal attitude, my tribe's attacked or my tribe's on the attack, and whatever my tribe does is okay. You see it in the hearings with some of the testimony when, how can you defend the indefensible? Well, you can defend it when your tribe is the one being attacked. And so we think tribally, we don't think politically. We think about how my tribe is affected. And so, even in the Clinton years, I think wasn't that long ago, 20 some odd years, we had a different type of discussion about impeachment. We were all basically saying, yeah, Bill Clinton did something wrong. Was it impeachable? Today, it's, well, what did Dershowitz say today? Look, if a president does whatever he wants to do to help his reelection, that's not impeachable. No person in his right mind would say that. And yet, that's what a tribal ideology, a tribal viewpoint will allow you to say. I don't think Dershowitz believes that even. But his tribe loved it. And so, rather than use these as a public education, I think we just use it to sort out tribally.
This may feel like a really basic question, but if that is the case, then why are we doing any of this?
Yeah, this has been a question that I struggled with my conservative friends, where they said, you know where this is going.
Right.
And I said, yes. And so why go through this process? And then, the argument was always, well, based on a political calculation, who's it really going to hurt or harm in 2020? And I actually struggled with this a lot, and my response at the end was because the Constitution still has to mean something. Because when the moment arises, you still have to use that provision, even if you know what the outcome is, because then it does start to be like what President Trump said, where he said, the phony emoluments clause. And then it starts to be like the phony impeachment clause, where we only use it if we think that we're going to get a certain outcome. So, constitutional provisions, it's kind of like muscles. When the moment is there, you have to flex it. And I still think that there is something to the idea that our representatives responded to a moment, that they said, this is the appropriate tact. I think that there was a slim chance that this wasn't going to be the outcome, very slim. But if every constitutional provision and the decision whether or not to invoke it is just, is it going to be a political win or not, then the Constitution really fails to function.
As someone who really cares about the Constitution, my next question may make you like really cringe. Do average Americans and voters care that much about the Constitution and upholding it enough to say, yes, we need to go through this process because it means something, versus, well, just let us vote in November. If we want him gone, we'll get rid of him. If we don't, we get to keep him.
Do you want to go first and then I'll go? Go ahead. So, okay, let me just latch onto one thing you said, which is the idea of like, well, but look, we're just going to vote in November, so why are we going through this process? If President Trump is not an appropriate president, then we have a remedy that's now, 10 months away.
Yeah.
So, why basically bring Congress and the Senate to a standstill? For this reason, the impeachment clause is different from an election. Elections are fail-safes and protections against elected officials who might not be able to earn their job again, but so is impeachment. And so the idea that you're entitled to your full term is wrong. I am entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness until I do something to transgress that norm. If I murder somebody, now I'm entitled to imprisonment. I mean, that's an egregious example. The other thing is, so why do we have, the founders struggled with this. Should we even have an impeachment clause? Because we have these 4-year terms, and so people aren't gonna serve forever. We won't have a king. And the response in part is because what if the election isn't really a safety valve? Because part of what you're accused of doing is undermining the next election. And so this was kind of on the outskirts of your question, but so you can't wait and hope that the election is gonna serve as a safety valve if the integrity of the election goes to the heart of the bad behavior. To your question of does the average person walk around and care about the Constitution? No, absolutely not. But a lot of more people know now that we have an impeachment clause, what high crimes and misdemeanors are, which is we really don't know until Congress tells us. And so in a way, this has been a really edifying moment. Unfortunately, as Michael said, it's also become a hardening moment. So everybody everybody has viewed this basically through their party registration, unfortunately.
Yeah, sorry. I thought you were going to have something to add.
I always do.
Okay, so totally get that. Voters, yeah, I'm not going to say what I normally say because there's a lot of people in here, but we can't always trust that the system will correct itself, regardless of who's participating. But what does it mean that we can't trust our elected officials to do it either? And that sounds like a biased question, but it seems like there's a bit of a struggle to acknowledge what's really happening on one side. And so what are we supposed to do with that if, okay, we voted, and now you're entitled to do your job, but once you breach the agreement that was made when you were elected, impeachment is supposed to be the fail-safe, but we do have to depend on our elected officials to execute that. Mm-hmm. What do we get to do when they don't do that?
Well, the Constitution is not a self-running mechanism. It has to be brought to life by people, by actions. And that's why, as an educational moment, as Professor Levinson was saying, this can have some impact and some meaning because it alerts people to certain things, alerts them that vigilance is the price you pay to protect liberty. There's a scene in Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises where one character was asked about how he got into this state of poverty, and he goes, how did it happen? And his answer was, well, gradually and then suddenly. And that's kind of where we are today, and what a kind of precipitous place we are. It's illustrated by a joke. So there's this guy's on the 50th floor of a building, and he jumps off. And about the 28th floor, someone looks out and he sees him fall, and he goes, hey, how's it going? And the guy goes, well, so far so good. So far so good. We can't take that risk because constitutions are fragile. Democracies are fragile. The forces against them are powerful, strong, and persistent. Neil Young reminded us, rust never sleeps. And the same is true of our commitment to democracy. We can't sleep. And so, as Professor Levinson said, as a constitutional moment, we know what's going to happen. But as a constitutionally educational moment, that's, I think, its real value.
Okay. And just, we have to get to what's happening now, so I just want to quickly go through what has happened before we got to the Senate. But so we get through kind of the inquiry process, and then we get to the point that articles of impeachment have to be drawn up. Do you think, so there were 2 articles of impeachment, do you think that Democrats made the right decision with the articles that they chose, or could it have been more expansive? And I ask that question both from a constitutional standpoint or a legal standpoint where there was evidence to bring more articles, and from a political standpoint, would it have made sense for them to do that, or would they have well, again, we know how it ends, but risked overplaying their hand?
No, I think that's one of the key questions. In the Democratic caucus, when they were trying to figure out what to do, they had in their hands the most obvious impeachable offense that the president committed. He committed it the day he stepped into office, which was the emoluments clause. They have nothing but evidence on that.
And
They
could you
chose
just
not.
describe what that is? I know we've used
Okay.
the term a few times.
The emoluments clause basically says that no federal official can take things of value from a foreign country, because the framers were very worried about this. There were a number of examples in the early republic of the French and the British trying to bribe American officials. And so the context of it is that they had something really important to fear at that time. And then we kind of forgot about it because, we don't see, the French coming in, money under the table. And so we kind of forgot about it. It became one of those lost provisions of the Constitution. But it was something that they had so much evidence on. They chose not to put it in there. They decided that they wanted to provide the public with the KISS method, keep it simple, stupid. And so they basically, I think, underestimated you and said, let's give them something they can understand, something we can talk about. And my view is that they blew it. Jessica, I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I really don't know the answer in the sense that, when the outcome is predetermined, it's really hard to kind of reverse engineer and say what would have been better. I think that the emoluments, you described it really well, but I think it feels it feels
Inside
people,
baseball?
Yeah,
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like it directly impacts anybody's life. It feels like it's this kind of what the emoluments clause really is it's a constitutional provision, as you said, that's like a conflict of interest code. It's like an anti-corruption provision of the Constitution. And so was there enough there? Absolutely, I think so. But we don't have case law on the emoluments clause because people have adhered to it in the past. People just haven't violated it. So there's not a lot that House managers could really comfortably point to and say, we've seen this, like, well, in U.S. versus this, and in this case and in that case. So I think it would have felt like it was this more kind of amorphous, indirect animal. Now, the fact that it's narrow, though, it does miss this huge swath of impeachable behavior. I think Nancy Pelosi, who was basically dragged kicking and screaming to go into an impeachment inquiry, said, if we're going to do this, it's just based on the call with the president of the Ukraine and whether or not he tries to thwart the inquiry itself. And we're not going outside of that ambit.
So they didn't go as wide as they could, but they did focus on Ukraine, and what the president was accused of was trying to exchange not even a real investigation, but an announcement of an investigation into the Bidens for foreign aid. And as we got along in the inquiry and kind of people conceded that, okay, he did this, this was a quid pro quo, but it wasn't so bad. I think Mick Mulvaney said, yeah, it happens all the time, it's totally fine. Was he write about that? Were we concerned about the wrong things? And if so, was that article the best and strongest article to bring forth?
So Mick Mulvaney was exactly right when he said, quid pro quo, get over it. That happens all the time. That's exactly right, but not like this. So the Democrats were in this endless search for the quid pro quo, and it felt like so beside the point to me for a couple of reasons. One, you could have alleged a campaign finance violation. The president saying, but do something here for me, which is a thing of value for his election campaign. That's a really clear and really crisp federal election code, which can rise to the level of a criminal violation. The House decided not to go that way, but that does not require a quid pro quo. It just requires, please do this for me. So Mick Mulvaney was right. That happens all the time. We say, you'll get your money if we're sure it's, and then fill in the blank that's good for the American people. Mm-hmm. Fill in the blank that's good public policy. We don't say, sure, we'll get your money if you do this thing that's really good for me personally. And that, I know it might sound like splitting hairs, but that is the crux of what's different. Quid pro quo is entirely permissible. The idea that we use it and that it has to be negative or it has to be impermissible is just not correct. It's what you're asking for in return, and that's the crux of what the founders were worried about, that you're gonna use your public office, you're gonna misuse the public trust and say, now do something for me. I have this power. I'm the chief executive of the United States. Now do something for me. And so it's, I was very frustrated for a long time because we heard this like search for the quid pro quo. And it was so, I don't know why the narrative ran away with that when that wasn't what we should have been looking for.
Yeah, it's leverage. You try to, as a country, you get as much leverage as you can to get others to do the things that you need done or want done. And so if what you want to do in the Ukraine is do something to push the government to clean up its act, anti-corruption laws and enforcing them, and et cetera, you use what leverage you have for those good causes. There are good ends that you want to achieve. The United States, right after the end of the Cold War, used its leverage to get the breakaway republics to get rid of their nuclear weapons. How did we do that? We used leverage. We paid some of them, we gave them aid, we did all kinds of things, kind of a quid pro quo. We want you to get rid of the nuclear weapons. Here's what we'll do for you in exchange. But it was all based on what we nationally think of as our national interest. What we're talking about here is, this is in my interest, so I'll get reelected. I want you to go after my opponent, my most likely opponent. And so the difference is, a quid pro quo is not right or wrong, it's how it's used and how it's implemented. Used properly, it can leverage your power into something really positive. Used improperly, you investigate a political opponent.
Yeah. And one thing, you said this before, but it bears emphasizing that Alan Dershowitz got up today and said, even if the thing of value you're asking for is for help with your reelection campaign, that's not impeachable. I would say that just, and again, I'm actually not a registered member of either party. That's just wrong. As a matter of legal interpretation, that's just wrong. That's exactly what we were worried about, that you were going to say, now do something for me. And it was, any version of give me money, give me political leverage, help my reelection campaign. Like, if the founders were to have given a hypothetical, in that very warm summer when they were drafting the Constitution, it would have been this. It would have been a chief executive who just ran away with power and said, I have to be sure to keep that power. And look at Richard Nixon. It was the same. Yeah. It was the same fear of, what if I'm not reelected? I need to keep my power.
So how should that have been framed, instead of saying, oh, there was this exchange going on, and then it turned into, oh, exchanges are fine. It's just kind of how we operate. How should it have been framed so that, one, it was seen as more than just an okay exchange, but also so that voters and the American people could understand that there was something negative happening to them? Because when I hear, oh, he was trying to get something of value for himself to help him get reelected, that doesn't necessarily clarify how I'm being harmed. in any way?
Well, it's a very nuanced answer, and that's the problem. It doesn't fit on a bumper sticker. And so because of that, you have to go into a deep explanation of why it's wrong, how it's wrong, when it's right, and when it's wrong. And it's what professors do. We pontificate about those things. And so to ask the American public who, you have people who work 2 jobs, who have kids, 3 kids that you got to take to ballet, you got to take to soccer practice. People in their real lives are incredibly busy, and we can't expect them to know the nuances. What we can hope for is that they'll wake up and pay attention when they need to. And that's where it is the responsibility of the opposition to make that case. I'm not sure the Democrats made that case very well, and I use the analogy of what happened to Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was saved by his political enemies. Newt Gingrich and those guys going so far that you looked and said, boy, if that's the choice. And Donald Trump also has a bit of that. He brings out the worst in his adversaries. You so want to get him that you start to imitate him. And you go into the gutter with him. And that's the one thing, if we do that, and like Jessica, I'm not a member of any organized political party. FDR's line after that was, I'm a Democrat. But no, we're both, I guess, non-party registration. Pardon? Was it Will Rogers? Okay, thank you. I sit corrected. Okay, here. But it's hard to expect the American public to be as interested as the interested public, such as ourselves, because it's what we do, it's what we love. If you're taking your kid to soccer practice, if you're working 2 jobs, you're just struggling to get by, and that's so many people are in that position. So when I want to pontificate, I blame the American public for all its sins, but really, it's hard to ask more of people who are struggling, and there are a lot of people struggling.
So I totally agree with you that the Democrats, I don't think, did a good job of like the crisp, let me tell you how it affects your life, which is basically your question. And I mean, it had to have been something like they went on every Sunday talk show and said, imagine you're a waiter and your manager gets all the tips, and then your manager has to distribute the tips at the end of the night. But instead, your manager who's entrusted with giving out all the tips skims off the top, or takes a percentage for him, which is supposed to show that he was doing a good job. It has to have been boiled down to like some totally identifiable moment. And I don't, House Democrats took the full 24 hours, and I don't think they ever had that moment where you're riding in an elevator with somebody and they say, what did the House Democrats tell me? We have 3 floors.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if I'm supposed to pick one way or the other while I'm up here, but so moving kind of past what the House did, they eventually on December 18th did vote to impeach Donald Trump. And then the next step is it goes over to the Senate for a trial. But the trial can't happen until the articles actually get to the Senate, and Speaker Pelosi actually held on to the articles for some time. Was that just a political decision, or was there something more to that, and was it a good decision for her to do that?
Well, I think it was too clever by half. Although I will say she did get one thing going, and that was the discussion of witnesses. That became much more in the public's attention. And so maybe she half won, but it's really uncharted territory. Could the Senate simply have said, well, they impeached, so we're going to move on? Or did they have to wait for the actual delivery? So there's all kinds of things. We don't do this that often. We don't have impeachments, thankfully, every 10 years, 5 years. And so there's a lot that's unwritten, a lot that's based on custom, a lot that's based on common sense. You write the rules every time you do the process, and you don't write a full set of rules. And so I think because Nancy Pelosi, as Professor Levinson said, was so hesitant at first, I think she was groping for an answer too. Did she get the right answer? I don't know. What do you think?
I think we have to come to, we're friends off stage and we team teach. We have to remember, if based on the night, are we going to be professor, or are we going to go by first name? Because I keep going up and back too.
You can call me Timmy. No.
So did she make a mistake? In a way, so what I heard in part of the question and answer today was which I don't think was a real question and answer. It was, arguments masquerading as questions. Well, wow, wasn't this a huge rush until Nancy Pelosi decided it was no rush at all? And then she didn't even slow walk. She snail walked it over to the Senate chamber. So I think they lost a little bit on that part. On the other hand, if you really know what's going to happen in the Senate, we all were talking about, well, wait, what do you mean? They have the power to set up the rules, and who has the power to determine whether witnesses are going to come? And wait, we're not going to hear from witnesses? And what does the Chief Justice do? And aren't they going to tell us what the procedures are before we pick our House managers, which are the prosecutors? And more evidence actually came out during that time. So I think overall, it was a win for her. All of these things are difficult to say because the war will be lost. But in terms of the battle, I think that was her only hand to play. And I think that she actually played it well by saying over and over again, you're really not going to tell us what the rules of the game are?
Yeah. And so you just mentioned this, but part of the rules that they had to come up with were whether or not they more documents would be admitted into the trial, and if there would be any witnesses that would testify. Could you two speak to why Democrats wanted so much for documents and witnesses to be admitted, and Republicans, I don't want to characterize them as being very resistant. It seems that way, but they at least were not eager about having witnesses and documents.
Well, if you go back through American history and look at all of the impeachments that have led to trial, almost 20, every single one had witnesses. So the question isn't, should we have witnesses? The question is, why should we not have witnesses? What is it that prevents us? And so I think basically the narrative was captured by the Republicans, and they've won that argument because the terms of debate are now, well, we're begging to have witnesses. And I understand the argument that the time is of the essence, that we have a president who has stonewalled, will stonewall, and will continue to do so. And I am somewhat sympathetic to the argument made by the Republicans that said, well, is the president, in refusing to hand over documents, refusing to let anyone in the administration speak, is that an obstruction of Congress, or is that merely the normal assertion of your institutional rights? I think you can make a good argument that I don't find it completely persuasive, but you can make a reasonable argument that says that, you guys haven't pushed Trump to the limit. When you push the president to the limit, that's when this accommodation phase takes over, where you're supposed to meet and talk and work out a bargain, which every single president and Congress that have had this conflict, they work out some kind of a bargain. Now, maybe this one wouldn't have made a deal, but you don't know that. And so I think in that sense, the Republicans are on not solid ground, but at least I think they have an argument to make that the second article might be a bit premature.
So just on the issue of witnesses, it does honestly baffle me that the idea that we can say, no, less information is good. I just don't actually understand that argument. And I don't really understand the enormous time pressure in the sense that, look, I know the Iowa caucuses are coming. I know, if you're Amy Klobuchar, I understand the enormous time pressure. But otherwise, this is when you don't get to choose the moment for impeachment. It happened. And so the idea that less information would somehow be more helpful when you're actually trying to allegedly get to the bottom of the case is curious to me. The other thing I would say is I think it's important to disentangle two things. One is on this obstruction of Congress. It's really based on the idea that President Trump just said, I'm not taking part in the impeachment period. And this is something we talked about a lot in our class when we taught together in the fall. That's just that categorical, I am not complying, is not something that we've ever seen. We absolutely almost always see, okay, you get this person, but they're not going to talk about this. Or you get these documents, but not these documents. There's some, it's called accommodation. We've never seen good luck to you. I'm not acknowledging the process. But even if, and been a number of lawsuits that have gone forward of saying, there's been a subpoena, this person should come in. That's just the first threshold. That's just you get them in the door, but it doesn't guarantee that they're going to speak. At that point, they say executive privilege or national security. So then you have a second, probably litigation, where you have to then say, well, what is really covered by executive privilege? The Supreme Court, when they decided to recognize executive privilege amid Watergate, never, I think, envisioned that it would be used as this sword, basically, to say, I will not comply with ongoing proceedings. So the idea that executive privilege stretches this far is not at all was envisioned by any of the courts. So I think we've kind of married those two things together of, on the one hand, people aren't walking in, and then we think once they walk in the door, they're going to talk. That's not at all guaranteed. So House Republicans and Senate Republicans are exactly right. This could take a while in a regular circumstance. This is not a regular circumstance. This is an impeachment inquiry. We happen to have a very well qualified jurist in the chambers. The Chief Justice is there to rule on evidentiary issues, including privilege. I mean, the Chief Justice also, there was a great op-ed, and I'll stop talking. There was a great op-ed where 3 professors said the Chief Justice on his own can call witnesses. And so if you look at the Senate rules for impeachment, I think that's exactly right. You don't have to wait for a vote of the Senate. The Chief Justice could wake up one time, have a personality transplant, decide that he wants to take part in this, and he could subpoena these witnesses. And because that's not an evidentiary decision, that's a substantive decision, he could not be overruled by a simple majority of the Senate. It would take 2/3 of the Senate to overrule. Now, I think Chief Justice John Roberts, just his personality is he basically would prefer to walk in there with, a paper bag over his head and just drink from a straw and hope nobody recognizes him, looks at him, acknowledges his existence. So it's not going to happen, but I would argue that a Chief Justice who takes the role more seriously should say, trial is the moment where we're going to hear from people, and not hear from people who are distractions and shiny objects, but hear from people who can actually tell part of the story.
And so as you see, a dictatorship is much more efficient. The jungle is efficient. When you figure out who the alpha dog is, the alpha dog rules. And I would make a decision like that. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what we try to get away from. And in the weeds here of the minutiae, it's not minutiae, it's not trivial at least, how complex a system based on rules is, how difficult it is to maintain it, to make sense of it. An illiberal democracy, Russia, where you have a strong man who's elected by the people to exercise power, is so efficient. Our system is not efficient. It was not built to be efficient. It was built to have these checks, these balances, these procedural roadblocks and hurdles that are maddening. Is that better than the jungle? That's the way I started, and that's the way I'll leave it here. Is that complex system that is just maddening, is that better than the jungle?
And Russia, by the way, has a great constitution, but who cares? I mean, because this is one of the things when we decided to team teach a class, or you basically let me into your class called The Power of the Presidency, that I heard myself saying in every class, which is the Constitution is this document that envisions that people will behave badly, but within these bounds. Right. The Constitution doesn't envision that people are going to behave badly, within these bounds. And that's what we're seeing. The Constitution doesn't envision that you're going to say, I didn't get it through Congress, I'm declaring a national emergency, which, by the way, President Obama did too to try and get around Congress. The Constitution doesn't envision that you're going to say impeachment inquiry. I'm not fighting you about subpoenas. I'm just not replying, period. And so much of the Constitution, you're right, it's complicated, it's messy, it's not efficient, but the framers were in a really weird way naive. So they didn't trust us, and that's why they created checks and balances. But then in another way, I think they were naive because they envisioned President Trump, but then they didn't envision the Senate saying, well, okay.
Yeah, and you raised an important point. When did you lose control of this, by the way?
I'm going to have to skip a few questions, but I think this is important.
The framers had a very jaundiced view of human nature. They knew that we were weak and fallible, that we would exercise self-interest above public interest quite often. And therefore, they didn't want to, that's why we don't have a democracy. That's why we have a republic based on a rule of law and a constitution. Because we are weak. We sometimes make mistakes. We sometimes act on self-interest. There's the great scene in, it was The African Queen, where Katharine Hepburn plays the dowdy old maid, and Humphrey Bogart plays the alcoholic ne'er-do-well who owns the ship, and they have to go down the river together, and the Germans are chasing them, and Bogart plays Mr. Allnut, I think it was called, and he's a heavy drinker. And one morning he wakes up from a hangover, and there's Katharine Hepburn pouring all of his liquor into the river. He goes, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And she starts to give him this moralizing speech, and he goes, "No. You don't understand. It's human nature." To which Katharine Hepburn says, "Mr. Allnut, human nature is what God put us on earth to overcome." And that's kind of what the Constitution does. It sort of is our conscience. It stands above us to say, I know you're going to screw up now and then. I'm building that into the system. Does it always work efficiently? No, it hardly ever works efficiently. Does it work? Well, I think Winston Churchill said it best, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the other ones ever invented.
We're not about to end. That would have been like a good note to end on, but I'm going to go back
Thank you and good night. I'll be here on Friday. We work blue on Friday, so no.
Kind of go back to where we were in the process of the Senate trial and talking about the witnesses and documents. So I won't go through all of the witnesses I have down here, but I think two potential witnesses that would be really appealing to people from a political standpoint, probably an entertainment standpoint, but from a process standpoint as well, are John Bolton and Lev Parnas. I'm just trying to get my head around, especially both of them. Lev Parnas, it would have been great if, I guess, he got arrested sooner and needed to share all of this information. But do you think he is someone that, if we're able to bring witnesses in, that would be a credible witness? His introduction into, kind of our consciousness is that he's a criminal. But as far as Democrats are concerned, the information that he's sharing, if it's truthful, is very useful. So is that someone they can rely on to help them make their case?
Oh, he's a terrible, terrible witness to have. He's suspect from the beginning. The only question is, does he have material to corroborate? If he has that material, he becomes very valuable. But even that, he's a Saturday Night Live character. He would add a lot of comic relief, and he might add some damaging information. But what you really want is Bolton. Yeah. You really want the acting chief of staff. You want the secretary of state. You want the grown-ups. They have a story to tell. Will they tell it? I don't think they will.
Yeah, right. It's in the book. One thing that about the witnesses, like, are they credible or are they not credible? Or I guess two things. One, in every courtroom, the lawyers in the audience know this, you're stuck with your witnesses, and a lot of times they're not great people. And so the key is exactly what you said. What does the evidence show? And I'll say this is the thing that makes me insane about, well, what if the whistleblower was biased? Or the Steele dossier, what if that was paid for by political opposition? Who cares if it's corroborated? Let's say the whistleblower absolutely loved President Trump. Let's say the whistleblower absolutely hated President Trump. Who cares if it's corroborated? I don't care who that person is. Let's say this is exactly what they wanted to happen. Fantastic. And so, all of the witnesses are useful if they can tell a story that is backed up by evidence, or that they are comfortable telling under oath. Not every criminal, and this is crazy to say, but not every criminal is always lying under oath. But certainly, I mean, I think Saturday Night Live character is exactly right.
Should any of the potential witnesses who have, seemingly maybe they're listening to Donald Trump say, anything you have to say is, falls under executive privilege, should any of them be thinking about potential jail time? Like, is there anything outside of the impeachment trial and impeachment process that they should be thinking about as they are, I hate to use this word, but kind of colluding with President Trump to help him get off?
So, look, if you are worried about executive privilege what you should do is there should be some discussion between the president and the House managers or the Senate and say, what specifically do you think is privileged? And then if you're worried about jail time, then say, Mr. Chief Justice, I'm really worried about jail time, or don't say that, but say, I'm worried about what I can say. We have the most powerful jurist in the whole world sitting there. Ask him what's covered by executive privilege. Mm-hmm. If he says yes or no, that's it. You have cover. You're not going to jail if he says it's okay. Mm-hmm. I mean, if he says no, I think that's covered, then don't then say, well, I don't care. I'm going to take my, I'm going to risk it. But nobody's going to jail for talking.
Okay. I'm going to get to audience questions, so I'll just kind of ask a really big question. Over the past, I guess, week and a half, the Senate trial has been taking place. It is going to continue until it's done, but it's still going on right now. But so far, both sides, both the House managers and the president's defense team, have made their arguments and tried to make the case for what they want the outcome to be. Who's doing well? What's the argument that they're putting forth, and is it effective? Or are people even paying attention?
I think Adam Schiff has become the star. His political stars really just shot up. I think Alan Dershowitz has fallen into the gutter. You're on stage, and it's a big stage, and you've got a chance to really make an impact and to make your case. A lot of the Democrats did poorly. Nadler, I thought, really hurt the Democrats, whereas Schiff really helped them. Mm-hmm. I think the president's lawyers initially did a terrible, terrible job. They brought it back to reality a little later, but I don't think it's been our finest moment for the law. What do you think?
Oh no, certainly not. I mean, this is it's like a train wreck that then you pour gas on, and then there's a fire, and so I think that both sides have done an enormously effective job at giving cable news the sound bites that they need for the nighttime when most people will turn in for a moment. Look, this room, you don't come to a museum to hear a speech about impeachment and be a kind of normal person. You're much more civically engaged. You're much more educated. I mean that in a great way. So both sides have given their party or their supporters just enough. I think very few people were streaming the whole thing. I couldn't stream the whole thing because my shoulder just couldn't withstand clenching that much. But in terms of the lawyering, I actually think both sides made mistakes. I think that the House Democrats, as we said, they failed to give that punchy, you go to dinner with somebody who opposes President Trump or supports President Trump, tell me in tell me in a moment. And, for the president's attorneys, I think that, somebody said, wow, they have a really high mountain to climb. Look at what a great job the House Democrats have done. And I thought, they can get up there and say, there's no mountain. All they have to do is give the Senate Republicans cover. All they have to do is give them a story to tell. And the story can be, well, we don't like it, but does it really rise to the level of impeachable offenses? And the last thing I'll say, there's this utter nonsense about you have to have committed a federal crime for impeachment. There's so many things where you're right. We spend our days going up and back. On the one hand, on the other hand, That just is not, that's not possible because we didn't have a federal criminal code. We did have federal criminal common law, but everything that you read about what high crimes and misdemeanors was intended to mean is that it was something broader, more amorphous, and frankly, scarier in a lot of ways. A DUI is a crime, but it's not impeachable. Abuse of power is not a crime, but it is impeachable.
Yeah. And to add to that, it's also a question of to whom are you speaking? Who is your audience? Who's the target? The president's attorneys are speaking to a narrow band who watch Fox every night. And that's why, for example, Mitch McConnell 2 days ago said, "Oh, I don't think I have enough votes to block witnesses." And that was the cue to Hannity to go on TV and tear Mitt Romney apart. To tear Mitt Romney apart? No, to warn all the other Republicans that if you go against Mitch, if you vote for witnesses, I'm going to do that. We're going to do that to you. Do you want to face Donald Trump's tweets and Fox News' anger? You don't. And so I think Mitch McConnell is a genius. I think he may be a wicked, evil genius, but he's brilliant. He's a great tactician. He's a magnificent Machiavellian. And so I think that was completely rehearsed, and it was a brilliant move because Mitch knows the audience. The audience is Donald Trump's base. He doesn't care if it's only 43% of the public or whatever. But that base, if it stays loyal, and in 2020, if it turns out at a high percentage, 2020 is going to be decided by one thing, and it's turnout. Donald Trump will get his folks to turn out, will the Democrats? That's the biggest question of 2020. And so it's who you're speaking to. The Democrats are speaking to a wider audience. The Republicans are speaking to a narrower audience. Sometimes it's just an audience of one.
After this last question, we can take some from the audience. So I think there are mics that will be passed around. But my last question for you two is, we know how this is going to end. Donald Trump, 99% sure he will not be removed from office. But in 20 years, when we are looking back at this and this is written up in the history books, how do you think this will be reflected on, both from a legal standpoint, from a historic standpoint, and maybe a political standpoint as well?
Well, I can tell you what the history books will say in 20 years because I'm going to be writing them. What we'll say is Mar-a-Lago is now underwater because of global climate change. I think one of the things they'll say, and again, I think you're right, the outcome is predetermined, is that it was one of those efforts to rein in power. And that's been, as I said, the jungle analogy. That's who we are as a country. Our mission is to keep the jungle at bay. And I think it will be seen as an effort to do just that, as an effort to keep the government honest. Madison's great quote, we've been quoting the framers, it's fabulous for me, who said, if men were angels, government wouldn't be necessary. Period.
Okay.
We should
have
end
any-
with that.
Okay. So yeah, whoever has the mic can ask a question.
I wish there was a more engaged crowd.
And also, just so as many questions as possible can be asked, if we can keep the questions brief.
Yeah, and everyone at once, so we can get all the questions in at once. And no.
This question's for Professor Levinson. Actually, more a statement. I have to agree with you at this point that the impeachment was kind of forced upon the Democrats and necessary, because I think as an argument to anyone, including Trump supporters, is if you don't enforce the rule of law, which everybody's supposed to expect, then at some point, you, a Trump supporter, will have somebody in the White House who is not going to support you, and you will then have to be afraid of him because he won't enforce the rule of law like we expect.
Yeah, that argument is something that I think just hasn't latched on in any of the situations. Like, do you want your chief executive to be able to declare a national emergency? Do you want your chief executive to be able to ignore congressional subpoenas? Do you want your chief executive to be able to ask foreign powers for personal favors. And I think that we're in a moment that's so polarized that none of the Republicans have said, we're vastly expanding executive reach. I mean, think about the travel ban. Like, do we want, and this is something we said in class all the time, don't ask if you want President Trump to have that power. Don't ask if you want President Obama to have that power. Ask if you want anybody in the Oval Office to have that power.
In fact, I'm sure you can see what fun it is to teach with Jessica, because she does start almost every class with, okay, what if your political rival had this authority? How would you feel? And it's a very good test. And I think the Republicans may get what they want and regret it. Donald Trump's oft-repeated statement, I have Article 2, I can do anything. I mean, I just bristle when I hear that. Not just because of Trump, but because it is so ahistorical, aconstitutional, and I think a bit amoral.
Hello. Are any of you aware of any really good infographics or visual aids that track the many moving parts of this complex issue, the characters, the events, and especially the ideas and issues it's raised? Something where you can look at a big poster and get a sense of the big picture.
Well, this company I work at called Crooked Media, that is kind of where we've plugged into the impeachment process. I think you'd probably have to go to Instagram or Facebook and Twitter, our social media handles, to see them. But at the start of the impeachment, we kind of made a little flow chart that was like, this is everything that's going to happen. And as we move in the process, we kind of do a little "you're here now." And during the hearings, we did little cards on this is who the witness is, and this is what we've learned from everything.
Where's the website online?
So this stuff is not on our website. It's going to be on our social media handles. But if you go to crooked.com, you can find our social media handles there and find all of those infographics.
Crooked.com.
Yes.
I'm going to assume that by November, we won't be discussing impeachment. I'm also going to assume that we're going to have a very close election, electoral college election, and both sides are going to claim voter fraud. So assume there's no voter fraud, but what advice will you give to the losing side to unite the country?
Oh, that's a you question.
That's a time when you rise to greatness. That's the character test. It's what Al Gore passed. I'm not an Al Gore fan, but he passed it. He could have fought the 2000 race. He could have, but he didn't. And that's character. There are different forms of character as represented in public officials. One is your public character, the things you do as an office holder. One's your private character, what do you do at home? But constitutional character is one of the keys that we neglect. And I think that will be a time when the loser, whoever it is, needs to stand up and say, this is a great country. I gave it my all. We need to pull together. This is one nation. We have a lot to do. Let's get doing it. I give my full support to person X.
That is very big.
It's
of
what
that
we
person.
it's what we used to do all the time. It's what we used to do all the time. But now with our tribalism, we don't do that much.
Can I just ask a question to that? Do you think it's only tribalism, though? I'm just thinking about the 2016 election and all of kind of the cloudiness around it and whether or not Trump actually won. So I wonder, it's hard to say that if all of that happens again, had he gotten away with what he was trying to do with Ukraine, that whoever the Democratic nominee is, should just kind of say, okay, you were the better man, and we all got to come together now.
No. Well, I mean, if you find that the Russians are doing what they did, then I think you have to call them on that. So, but assuming that you don't have the gross manifestations of
That is the big slide.
illegality or fraud, then yes.
I don't know.
Hi.
Who has the mic?
Yeah, who has the mic?
in the back.
Why did Nancy Pelosi resist bringing impeachment, and then what prompted her to finally do it?
Well, I think you've seen it the last few weeks, how difficult it is to move people to do this. This is a huge thing to impeach and then convict a president. In 2.5 centuries, we've never thrown a president out. I think she knows how big it is. I also think she felt that it might distract from what really is what she wanted, which was to make the case that the Democrats made in 2018 on the different actual issues. If 2020 is fought on the impeachment issue again, then Nancy Pelosi thinks she is in a weakened, the Democrats are in a weakened position. She wants it fought over climate change. She wants it fought over income inequality. She wants it fought on fairness, those kinds of issues. And you can easily see where Donald Trump would fight this old war again, and it'll be all about impeachment. Those bad Democrats, those evil Democrats, they failed and I've been exonerated.
Years ago, a folk singer said, "Reality is bad enough, why should I tell the truth?" And with that sort of sideshow element of what's going on right now, do you think the stage could be set for a very unique movement to get first-time voters to dare not to vote? To really get them out there and differently than any other election we've had in modern times?
Historically, younger voters don't show up. Barack Obama energized them. And so who in the Democratic Party would energize them? It's sort of amazing to me that my students, 19-year-olds, love Bernie Sanders. And I go, why?
But I'm not asking,
Okay.
I'm asking the question about whether this impeachment event could become a unique platform to say, hey, look what's going on, you must go out and vote. It's just I'm just asking you, you have a better opinion of that than I do, although I do have an opinion.
What do you think?
I think it can happen, and I have uncovered 2 quotes by FDR and JFK that I think, unfortunately in my hands, they're sort of like spaghetti. In your hands, and perhaps I'll get your email address and send them to you, they could be unbelievably powerful for that reality is bad enough. And they were both, one was said in 1936.
Well,
Okay.
yeah, no, we'll be here after. We just want to make sure we get to everyone because there's a lot of people who have questions here. Yeah.
Okay, if we know
Thank you.
if we think we know how this movie ends, and the outcome, administration says, "See, I'm exonerated," and the administration is reelected. What about if the administration pushes harder on executive, pushes the jungle even harder? Will this impeachment we went through be something that what people say, what a waste, or will
that
it
we
be,
regret.
or do we regret it, or will it maybe motivate us to push again?
So, I think that you can't look at the political fallout of the impeachment right now. So much, it's like, having, like, why did that person have a tantrum? You have to look at it much later and say, like, were they hungry? Were they tired? What happened? So when it comes to the impeachment and should we push ahead and was it a potential mistake, I think that it's going to come down to our conclusion will come down to things that are unrelated, which is how many voters came out in those swing states, and if those voters come out in those swing states, and I don't think there's a chance they come out because of impeachment. Or I don't think there's a good chance they come out because of impeachment. I think they're going to come out because of health care. They're going to come out of what they think about the environment, what they think about taxes, what they think about immigration, what they think about criminal justice. If they come out and the Democratic nominee wins, it's going to look like Nancy Pelosi was a genius for going forward. Yeah. And if they don't come out, or the Democrats nominate somebody who just turns off too many people, then it's going to look like, I can't believe you pushed forward with impeachment.
I want to ask you if the White House can completely silence Ambassador Bolton. Because Bolton was a star in the Fox channel, and he has maybe the ability to convince a few people if he goes ahead. But he has been reluctant in part because he wants to publish the book. Now the White House can the White House impede the publication of the book? And can the White House somehow impede him from going public and speaking out?
Those are two questions. Can it impede the publication of the book? The answer is yes, for a time. Because you have to get it vetted so that there are no national security secrets or something like that. And in fact, the White House sent a letter out to the publisher today saying, sorry. Now, can they silence Michael Bolton? He can go on MSNBC tonight and spill the beans. He could go and testify if he wanted to. And so you have two very different answers to that. Yes, the White House could stop it. No, they can't stop him.
Good evening. You've indicated earlier, or everybody sort of agrees, is this whole impeachment is a preordained type of exercise we're going through. And then you said earlier, Professor, that you felt the Democrats made a mistake in just bringing the 2 articles of impeachment. That was wrong. And then you flipped over to emoluments. And I don't know why emoluments would grab the public any more than the 2 articles we have right now. And then you ignored the Mueller report, which had about 7 reasons. So what is really your view on what the Democrats should have done in their articles of impeachment?
I think you either go big or you go small. And going small, I'm not sure that that's worked very well for them. So if you go big, then you add emoluments, you add the obstruction of justice, some of the things that Mueller reported on. When Mueller released his report, it just felt like a dead weight. And so I think the Democrats felt that, that was then, this is now, that's the old news, we need the new news. And it was a strategic decision to go small. I don't know if you, or either of you have something to.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I think that, this isn't fair because things don't go stale, but the Mueller report, I think it feels like we lived through that and it's over. There was plenty in part 2 of the Mueller report that dealt with obstruction. There was plenty there to go forward. And I think Nancy Pelosi just felt like we can't start throwing everything in. We have to look like basically that this was thrust upon us. We have to look like we had no other choice. We have to do our constitutional duty. For the other things, I think it brings it, for emoluments, for the Mueller report, I think it brings up the issue of, well, basically, what took you so long? Were you just waiting to, for there enough there so you could put in the stew and hope, or, hope something was going to catch fire? So it's not really fair and it's not really right, but it just feels like, I guess our students would say like, oh, the Mueller report's so over. It's so last week. And unfortunately, I think
That
that's
is so
what happened.
2019.
We will just be able to take this last question wherever the microphone is right now. Oh, okay.
My question is, if Bolton were to appear in public and spill the beans, as you say, at what personal consequence would that be?
Fox News would probably not have him on very much. And plus, his home is in the conservative wing of the Republican Party. They might shun him. He thinks he has a lot to say. He's a very smart guy, very experienced, and he wants to convince people that he's right. That door might close. He might be a leper in the Republican Party, never to be seen again, to be an outcast. And so I think for Bolton, that's why I think he said, I'll testify if you force me to. If you subpoena me, please subpoena me. Yeah. And then I can say, I only did it because I had to. I think he wants to tell the story, but for self-interested reasons, it's hard for him to break from the ecosystem on the right.
Could I just add a question to that question? Is there any way that if he testifies or spills the beans that Donald Trump can retaliate against him and kind of leverage his position as president to do that?
Tweet.
So he has, this is something else we talked about. He really has politicized the Department of Justice. And I think if you look at, the members of cabinet, who did Donald Trump really get his money's worth from? Attorney General Barr. Oh my goodness, has he been an effective advocate for Donald Trump? Not really for the American people, but enormously effective for the president. And so, but could he say to Attorney General Barr, John Bolton, we have to do something about him. You still have to have committed a crime. We're still not in the place where you just get to round somebody up because we don't like them. There could be some accusations of executive privilege, but no, I think you're exactly right. It's the tweet storm. It's trying to socially ostracize him, and it's banning his Fox News privileges.
Well, that's not so bad. Can we give Jessica and Michael another round of applause for joining us today? And thank you to you all for coming out and caring and staying informed. Hopefully it'll be over soon.